This is a CBC podcast. Podcasts. Man, there are so many of them out there. Hit it! Podcast Playlist collects, selects, dissects the best. Podcast Playlist with hosts Matt Galloway and Lindsay Michael. Find it at cbc.ca/podcast playlist or subscribe on iTunes or your favorite podcast app.
Hello and welcome to the At Issue podcast. Today, Andrew Coyne of the National Post, Chantal Hébert of the Toronto Star, and Althia of HuffPo Canada. The House isn't sitting this week, but there's still plenty of news. We'll break down whether a government can in fact grade itself, the peacekeeping announcement, and your bonus podcast topic today, why a former Conservative cabinet minister who once said legalizing marijuana would be like legalizing murder is now selling it.
Times have changed. Now, all too often, there is no peace to keep. The conflicts we face today are intractable, more dangerous, and more complex. Modern peace operations take place in a context that transcends borders and includes a challenging range of actors.
That was Justin Trudeau back on Wednesday announcing his plan for Canada's peacekeeping commitment much later and a little lighter than Liberals' first promise. And even though the House of Commons isn't sitting right now, At Issue sure is. Andrew is in Toronto tonight. Chantal is in Montreal, and Althia is here in Ottawa, just down the hall from me, I think. Good to see everybody. Okay, so let's dig into the peacekeeping thing. I'll start with you, Chantal. Is this what the Liberals telegraphed? Was this the right call?
Two different things. No, this does not live up to what they promoted in their platform. B, yes, the times have changed, but they already started to change when Jean Chrétien was Prime Minister. Yeah. And the conflict, civil war erupted in the former Yugoslavia. So when that platform was drafted, the times, they had already changed. Rwanda, all these things that happened, peacekeeping had become peacemaking. Is it the right call? That's a different issue. Possibly. Politically, it's, despite the heat the government gets this week, it's probably the easier call in the sense that beyond all the difficulties and the danger, this notion had set in that the Prime Minister wanted a seat on the UN Security Council, and there was a danger that if he did send a peacemaking mission somewhere, the spin would have been that he was putting young soldiers in harm's way to buy a seat at the Security Council.
That's interesting because, Andrew, I saw it the other way. I wondered whether the announcement would hurt that bid, but now I see Chantal's point.
Well, it's maybe a reason why you shouldn't be so overt in announcing your political intentions vis-a-vis the Security Council seat, because you will be second-guessed one way or the other, as you will be on this. Look, they either knew when they made the promise in October 2015 that times had changed, and they made the promise anyway, or they didn't know, and they should have, and they've only learned this in the last 2 years in office. And either way, it doesn't look terribly good on them. I think it's also going to be interesting to see how our international partners react to this. It's true to say that there's other ways to contribute than just putting boots on the ground, but it's a little bit like the combat mission against ISIS question. Why does it have to be necessarily a choice between the two? And when it comes down to it, the currency of these things is, in terms of respect from other countries, is, are you willing to put your own soldiers' lives on the line? And it's a little easy and cheap to say, well, we'll throw some money at it, but we're not actually going to take the risks.
Although the risk, to the Prime Minister's point, Althia, is much, much higher. I mean, that's the facts.
And that's clearly what they spent the last year and a half trying to decide, right? I mean, they made the commitment about 600 Canadian troops going somewhere, 150 police officers, 450 million to some unnamed UN peacekeeping mission. They spent so much time reviewing it. I think the defense minister went to Africa 3 times to look at different possible missions. And then clearly they decided it wasn't worth the risk, and they came up with a strategy where they appear to do a lot, but when you actually look at it, it's not that much. That being said, I don't think the discussion, although that's what the Prime Minister said in his speech this week, I don't think the discussion is really about peacekeeping having become peacemaking. We've known that for decades, actually. I think the discussion that happened in the last year and a half is also that we have a very different foreign affairs minister. Stéphane Dion was a man who believed in a Personian image of Canada abroad and blue bonnets and had a very, I think, romantic notion of peacekeeping. And Ms. Freeland is politically ambitious. Her concern is Donald Trump, and I think that also has a lot to do with this week's announcement.
I'll let you wrap it up, Chantal. Yeah, go. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can take the issue, and I agree with Althia about the Stéphane Dion view of the world, but if that is the case, it's because Mr. Dion was not listening to what was being said around the cabinet table when Jean Chrétien was Prime Minister, because all of these issues came up, and the reluctance to engage in those peacemaking missions did not start with Stephen Harper. And we had started to withdraw from our strong presence before Stephen Harper became Prime Minister.
And Dion didn't write the platform. I mean, this served the same function as the electoral reform pledge. It was a way of signaling to left of center voters, of appealing to that anti-Harper sentiment, that feeling that we needed to change course. So they were perfectly content to reap those votes with this. And as I say, they either knew they weren't going to fulfill the pledge or they didn't. But either way.
Okay, I wanted to save some time for something that Andrew, if you follow Andrew on Twitter, you know he had much to say about it. He wrote a column about it. But I'm going to start with Althia. I'll make him wait a moment. This mandate letter tracker that the government put out transparently, a place where Canadians can go and say, hey, how are these guys doing on your promises? Is this sort of normal for governments? Don't all governments try and grade themselves, Althia? Because I know there was a lot made about governments can't be objective, but I don't know if that was the point. So how effective is this?
Yeah, I mean, governments tend to do this internally. They don't tend to do this publicly. And because they've made this document public, it's become basically a different version of government spin. So things that if they were really being candid and honest, you know, the budget being balanced by 2019, 2020, they wouldn't put that in the listing of underway with challenges. They would acknowledge that that is a broken commitment, and they would put it in the government speak of not being pursued. They're not being frank. I think that there's a number of risks with this, but at the same time, you know, it's probably a laudable goal that it gives you an indication of what the government thinks of its own accomplishments. But if you're looking at this as a promise tracker, it is not that. And commitments that you care about, whether that's electoral reform or access to information legislation, like a lot of us journalists do on the Hill, you'll realize that the government has taken a very rosy approach to judging its own record.
Way to work in my name. All right, Coyne, off you go.
Well, you know, people will be forgiving of spin, and they'll be glad if you're transparent. What's really intolerable is to try and do both at the same time, and to put out this document as if it's an exercise in accountability, and then just use it to spin. If you were really serious about accountability, you'd get a third party to assess you. You'd make it clear they had an absolutely unvarnished mandate to say whatever they needed to say about it. I mean, the model would be the Auditor General, for example, looking into the government's books. But they didn't do that. They put this thing out, which immediately became, frankly, a laughingstock. And I think they deserve the opprobrium they're getting for it.
Although they're going to put something out in 2 weeks, Chantal, where it's going to be a little more detailed. You'll be able to see, how many roads they built, how many reserves now have drinking water. It'll be a little more practical. Would that help?
Yes and no. I find it very useful because it tells you a lot about the mindset of the government and the kind of lengths they are willing to go language-wise. It's almost 1984 and Orson Welles, the way some of the language is couched. I also think the really useful thing we got from this government was not what happened this week, but what happened way at the beginning when we were given access to the mandate letters, the mission statement for every department. That wasn't fake, and it's really useful. But then, not to date myself, but remember Jean Chrétien and the Red Book? He never said he would do anything about the GST, did he? So we didn't reinvent the wheel this week.
No, and part of the problem was that they were writing this off of the mandate letters and not the platform, and there are discrepancies between the two.
But
as well.
I really wonder.
Yes, exactly. Like door-to-door mail delivery. Remember that? I mean, that was a verbal pledge during the election campaign, but in the mandate letter, and in fact, in the platform document, it just says launch a review to make sure that Canadians get good service at a good price. Well,
the answer is in the mail,
that's not what they told Canadians at the doors.
Andrew, Chantal, last word. Yeah.
Well, you just wonder when you see that strange use of language. They couldn't bring themselves to say broken promise. You wonder sometimes whether it's actually as cynical and overt as it seems, or have they just lost contact with reality to that extent? Once you start speaking a language of euphemism that consistently, I think it's very easy just to fall into that and not even know you're doing it.
Okay, Chantal.
You didn't know they were testing weed, eh?
Is that it? That's how we're ending this? All right, everybody. Hey, podcast listeners, we're going to take on a third topic today that's exclusively for you on the podcast. And this time we're going to talk about Julian Fantino. Julian Fantino was at one point Prime Minister Stephen Harper's Minister of Veterans Affairs. Before that, he was Toronto's top cop. He was vocally opposed to the use of marijuana. These days, though, the tune has changed pretty radically. Take a listen to this.
You said in 2015, I am completely opposed to the legalization of marijuana.
Yes, that was the issue at that time, and I was addressing a different era, a different time.
Well, that was less than 2 years ago. What was the different era then?
Well, the different era is that now it's being made a legal item, and so therefore there's no point in me arguing the issue. What I do think is important, though, is that if and when it becomes a legal commodity, that the concerns expressed to ensure that there be proper education.
That's Julian Fantino talking to Carol Off on As It Happens. It was a pretty remarkable interview, although maybe not for the reasons Julian Fantino wanted. Chantal, what do you tell Canadians when you see a politician not only just radically change his position on this, but then find a way to make money out of it?
We talked about cynicism. What I mostly think is that in the Liberal backrooms of Parliament Hill, they must be really happy about Mr. Fantino. Because there you have this law and order figure recruited for that purpose and used to campaign against the marijuana legislation plan because he had been a top cop. And now having crossed over to what you could call, I guess, the dark side, it's going to make it a lot harder for the Conservatives to offer a critique of this legislation, and the Liberals can only be happy about that.
Althia.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, this was a man who voted for 6 months minimum sentences if you grew pot at home for medical reasons. He suggested that legalizing marijuana was like legalizing murder. And here he is, along with a deputy commissioner from the RCMP, Raf Sukar, starting a company to basically bring consumers closer access to medical marijuana. It's just a bit mind-boggling that when there's a buck to be made, what you perhaps assumed were like core principles that politicians held are just so easily bendable.
Andrew?
I'm less concerned with people changing their mind or even being hypocrites. What concerns me with this is beyond Julian Fantino is I recall seeing several stories now about cops of various descriptions getting into this business.
Yeah.
And you kind of wonder about that. Do they have an advantage from their previous experience, or do they see themselves as having some sort of advantage? If so, are they trading on that advantage in any way? That's concerning, and it's concerning in terms of the relationships or the reputation of serving police officers. Are their motives going to be called into question because people are thinking, well, what are you doing, after your police work?
Yeah.
There's going to be a lot of money made in the marijuana business. We've had earlier controversies about well-connected Liberals getting into the business. I think there's a lot of questions and certainly transparency that has to be brought to this.
Yeah, I mean, I think Terry Lake, too, out in BC, too, he has moved out of, he's not in cabinet, but he was health minister, and now he's moved into this field. Yeah.
Fantino's partner in this business is a member of the Trudeau task force on this. So there's some uncomfortable relationships here, let's put it that way.
Chantal.
And they are giving their good names or their record as a token for marketing purposes of marijuana. I agree with Andrew. It's mind-boggling to watch, but it is happening on a large scale. Julian Fantino is one example, but not an isolated one.
Okay, let's leave it there. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Rosie.
Bye.
That's At Issue for this week. Thoughts or comments? Get in touch. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca